Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. If you are joining us from Montreal, if you are joining us all the way from Israel or other parts of the Middle East, good evening. If you're joining us from Europe, a beautiful late, good late afternoon. And of course, if you're joining us from the West Coast, North America, a wonderful and bright good morning to you. Thank you very much for joining us here at the second session of our series from Montreal to Israel that we are offering under the auspices of the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. My name is Csaba Mikolényi. I'm the director of the Institute and also professor of political science at Concordia University. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to share you a very cute, well, I thought it was cute, maybe embarrassing for me, but about 3 months ago or so, of course, Israeli elections are very much a hot topic in the Jewish/Israeli community in Montreal, but all over the world. I was invited to speak and offer some words of wisdom about what I thought about the outcomes and the processes of that particular moment in the sequential, long drawn-out process of Israeli governmental and electoral instability. So I did that. I spoke for about an hour or so to a lovely, lovely group. And when I finished and the Q&A started, the first question that was put to me was the following. Professor, tell us about how Michal Cotler is doing in the Knesset. At that point, I knew that I had a homework. I knew that I absolutely had to do my best in order to bring member of Knesset, Michal Cotler-Wunsh, to you. And ladies and gentlemen, that is exactly what's happening today. We're just so delighted that the Knesset member, Michal Cotler, accepted our invitation, and here she is joining us live all the way from Israel, here at the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. Now, we are meeting virtually, but so I do have to ask you to please join me in giving a round of applause as we are welcoming Michal in this conversation. Michal, welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Csaba, and thank you everybody who's here for the opportunity to feel like I'm home in Montreal. I truly, truly appreciate it.
Michal, this is not the kind of conversation, this is not the kind of session where I would like to open by reading out the speaker's, the guest's distinguished biography. I would like to actually tease out the important milestones, the important contributions that you have made to Canadian, Montreal, Israeli, Jewish life in all of its complexity. So why don't I invite you to start telling us a little bit about who you are, what your personal story is, and how ended up with having that background right behind you? Because I don't believe that's a virtual background. That looks like you're sitting in the Knesset, or if it's virtual, you have access to something very special that we don't. So tell us a little bit about how you ended up, what was your Aliyah story?
Absolutely. Again, thank you. And, you know, I can't see everybody on my screen who's here, but I know there are people that I love and I feel so comfortable to share this evening with. And I am truly, truly grateful for the opportunity to engage with my community. And in Hebrew, you say, you know, that Adam u tavnit nof moladeto, a person is basically the product of our upbringing. And indeed, when I'm here this evening with all of you, this evening for me, a little earlier in the day for all of you, I'm truly fortunate to have the opportunity to reflect, to reminisce, and to engage with the question that you've just posed, Csaba. So I actually, for those of you that might not know me, and that would be okay too, I was born in Jerusalem and lived as a young child in the corridors of the Knesset. My mother was Menachem Begin's parliamentary secretary for then the Gachal party, which turned into Likud. And the night of what's called in Israel the overturn of the government, there's literally a coined word of that night, the word mahapach. Doesn't exactly mean revolution, but it means overturning. When Menachem Begin rose to power, I was a 7-year-old little girl in the Knesset cafeteria. That was a very, very important formative moment. I actually spoke about it in my maiden speech in Knesset when I entered several months ago into Knesset, because it was a very important evening. And in general, the tremendous privilege of having known the likes of Menachem and Eliza Begin and that entire generation, actually, Yechiel Kadishai, Esther Zinoor, really a generation of figurative giants, essentially, that laid down the physical infrastructure of the state of Israel. And then, as some of you may know, my mom met actually just around the Sharansky case, which my father, Professor Erwin Kotler, was constructing, the legal case and cause of then Anatoly Sharansky, refusnik, today known, of course, as Natan Sharansky. He met my mother, Ariella, and they married. So that had me move to Montreal. And I'll just share that in addition to mentioning and reflecting on Menachem Begin and having had the good fortune of not only knowing him, but really being a little girl in the Prime Minister's home playing piano for the Prime Minister and his wife, I actually also had the tremendous honor of Natan Sharansky being at my maiden speech. My parents were in Montreal and could not be there. And Natan instead came to my maiden speech, along with, and maybe I'll refer to it a little later, former Chief Justice Miriam Naor and the father of deceased soldier Hadar Golden. Simcha Golden was the third person that I had there. Because of COVID-19, we were very limited with guests. And so I moved to Montreal. Actually, when I moved to Montreal as a little girl, and this is where my emigration story back and forth begins, I didn't know a word of English. So that's something that sticks with you. I have to, share that it is not a simple sort of moment in anybody's life to move. And anybody who's done, Chaba, you would know, to move and to leave everything behind. And my connection to Olim is also just from the acknowledgement of how difficult it is to leave behind everything that you know and love. And then having grown up in Montreal and having the tremendous privilege of attending Akiva Elementary School and Herzliya High School, and I believe that I may have a former principal, Ala Gomolka, here with us this evening, and having had a tremendous education, a Jewish education, and not just a Jewish education, but an identity education. So a very, very deep understanding of our identity, not only from home, which of course we'll talk about probably a little bit later in terms of international law and human rights, but also just in terms of Jewish identity, the depth of Jewish identity and the connection to Israel. And so graduating Herzliya High School, I actually came to Israel on my own law after clerking at the Supreme Court and at the Ministry of Justice, and worked in the Ministry of Justice actually for several years, and then moved back to Montreal with my own young family to pursue a master's in law at McGill, and actually remained in Montreal for an additional 10 years. So in fact, this brings me to the next part of my own journey, and that is having children in Montreal and moving to Israel with 4 very Canadian children, moving back from Montreal rather to Israel 10 years ago. So back and forth and back and forth. And I tell you that story and I go into detail because I think actually it's very important that the multiplicity of identities, and of course, my Canadian identity being one that appreciates the multiplicity of identities, of multiculturalism and what that brings with it, of concepts that may be so embedded in us as Canadians and as Montrealers, and that may be foreign to others. I think that those have a tremendous impact on what I do today and how I or at least gives me insights on how I practice whatever it is that I do, whether it's law or as a lawmaker in the last year in Knesset. And no less importantly, the Jewish identity that I brought with me, the understanding of the formative years in Akiva School and certainly Herzliya, and the relationship between Israel and diaspora. And I say this very often, I feel very, very privileged because in many ways, it is those multiplicity of identities and the ability to function in both languages, but beyond languages, and of course French as well, but beyond languages, the nuanced understanding, the cultural understanding of difference that actually permits me to serve as more than a bridge, as more of a translator between the communities in Israel and diaspora, between various kinds of Jews here in Israel, and also between the various populations here in Israel, Jews and Arabs, and ultra-Orthodox and secular. And so that understanding and that capacity and the understanding of pluralism, so having attended a school where the late Rabbi Hartman, sort of inculcated the concept of pluralism so deeply into all of us, it took me years of living in Israel to understand that when I say the word pluralism, what I mean is something quite different than what exists so far in Israel. And I say that not as criticism, but as the work that we still have cut out for us, as we are still the founding generation of this very young 72-year-old, not so old, but 72-year-old country that is truly a miracle. And as the founding generation, we have a shared responsibility, both we in Israel and communities abroad, to create that shared vision for the future, for the next 72 years. So that's just a little bit in a nutshell about me. I entered Knesset, and Chaba, I don't know how you followed up on what I did because it was like a storm. I entered Knesset about a year ago, actually, and we can go into it a little bit later, but I don't want to bore you with the details. I actually came in what's called the Norwegian law, because in Norway, all ministers resign from their post as members of parliament so that there is no conflict of interest, and the people on the list below them actually enter as members of parliament there. The Israeli version of the Norwegian law is its own version, as everything else in Israel. And in fact, 5 MKs, 5 members of Knesset, including myself, entered the Knesset in that way. And then there were, all kinds of, as you referred to before, dramas, because I made the choice of joining with the unity government, joining the coalition as opposed to the opposition, after a series of, as you may recall, 3 elections, and we are now headed into our 4th, literally next week, and believing very deeply that the imperative for unity transcends all other challenges we face. And that was just at the beginning of COVID-19. So not without, realizing yet the tremendous challenges we would have financially and in terms of health and mental health and all of the other challenges that COVID-19 has brought with it, the deep concern for the internal resiliency of Israeli society is what led me to believe very deeply in the imperative to enter a unity government. Sadly, the party that I ran with and another party that formed Blue and White did not enter this unity government, which dramatically weakened Blue and White. And here we are heading into a 4th election in just under 2 years. I did join as an MK, and the result of me joining when there were very few members of parliament to represent Blue and White was that I am a member of something like 10 committees and subcommittees, which is an astounding number of committees and subcommittees. I am the chair of the Drug and Alcohol Use Committee. I'm a member of the Law Committee and of the Defense and External Relations Committee, of Women's Status, of Children's Rights. I am the chair of Israel Diaspora Subcommittee. I am a member of the Aliyah and Klita Committee, a very important committee where we've done a lot of work about, new and old immigrants to the state of Israel, and several subcommittees in the Defense and Foreign Relations Committee. What that has enabled me is actually a tremendous, very steep learning curve in a matter of just under a year of understanding parliamentary work, the significance of the parliamentary tools. So we're not just legislators, the importance of the supervising responsibility of the parliament, of the Knesset, of the legislative branch over the executive branch. And in a democracy, that is hugely important, what I just said, especially during COVID-19. And I repeat this in various contexts. COVID-19 invented nothing. By the way, in any country, invented nothing. It only exposed and deepened and presented opportunities alongside the challenges to understand what ails each of our societies and cultures and countries and legislation. So that has been really a tremendous learning curve, very, very steep, but very, very satisfying in one way, in the sense that the importance of the work done at the Knesset, both as a legislator and as a supervisor over the executive branch, and the utilization of the various parliamentary tools has been tremendous. Where it is, I would say, sad is that my Knesset term is over in under a year. I am not running in this upcoming election for of various reasons. We can discuss them later. But I do intend, and I am committed to return. I think that there is no place more important to impact policy, to lean in, to sit around the decision-making tables and to affect policy making and paradigm shifts, which are so necessary in our incredible and young country.
Michal, rest assured that we will be cheering for you and watching very closely as your political career unfolds, but not only because it's fascinating and important, but also because of what you wrote to me in that WhatsApp message that you probably don't even remember anymore. I congratulated Michal when she entered the Knesset, and this is what she wrote to me. And usually when I send messages to politicians, I don't get an answer, certainly not of this kind. This is what you said. Thank you, Csaba. Committed to fulfilling this mission with courage and humility for the sake of the entire Israeli public and the Jewish people. And you just told us about what that mission is. What I would like to pick up on is something that you kind of shared with us implicitly, and that's about your political journey. At the beginning of your introduction, you told us about Menachem Begin, the upheaval, the revolution, so to speak, and the Likud family that you grew up in, kind of. Well, not kind of, very, very much so. And then towards the end of your introduction, you told us about entering the Knesset as a blue and white representative. So the journey. How has Michal Cotler-Wunsh grown, changed ideologically, politically? Have you changed? Has Israel changed? Has your understanding of what Israel needs today changed? Is this a journey that you think is unique to you? Is this a journey that's perhaps not so unique amongst the Anglos, the Anglo community that we know interact with so intimately in Israel? Tell us a little bit about the values and the ideologies and that journey that you have traveled.
So you actually touched on the most important part of my answer in what you just said towards the end, and that is that the values that were inculcated into me from Likud, and again, I quoted Menachem Begin in my maiden speech, and he's still hanging in my office above my desk. I think in many ways the values that the Likud represented and perhaps still represents. So if we depoliticize it for one moment, this is actually the good news. The good news is that about 80% of Israel's population today probably agrees about 80% of the issues, 80% of the time. And that is really good news when you look at the world around us. I mean, you look at polarized societies around us all over the world. That is exceptional news. That means that actually what we see, and by the way, it's part of the reason we're in deadlock. It's part of the reason, it's not the only reason, but it's part of the reason that we're in deadlock and heading into a fourth election in 2 years. And that is because at the end of the day, when you look at the election results and at the ideology or the ideological differences between what's in the center of the platforms, the party platforms, as they publish them, if they do, something we can talk about later, they don't all have that sense of accountability to the voting public. So not everybody has a party platform, but blue and white's ideology, values, and certainly the portions of, the platform that I can sign on today and still are very, very close to Likud's, if it would publish a platform, Likud's platform, to the values that sort of guide it, the foundational principles. And I would say somewhere there in the middle, there are many more that agree on, actually in this election, this is the sad part. The failure of blue and white is what I just said. With the commitment to unity above all else was the guiding principle for me. The guiding principle right from the get-go, the guiding principle for joining blue and white, and recognizing that 80% of people, the population, agree on 80% of the issues, 80% of the time, and we need to create change. We need to create paradigm shifts that enable us to create good governance and transparency and long-term holistic plans that are applied equally and consistently to all. These are changes in the way that Israel functions, because as a surviving state, we're very accustomed to putting out fires and to putting on Band-Aids. And that mindset, actually, when I say this to Canadians, they say, yeah, you haven't said anything new. Good governance, transparency, accountability, long-term plans that are equally and consistently applied to all. That's not news. But in Israel, it is news. It's not the way that the state of Israel is geared. The way that the state of Israel is geared, because of its reality, is survival. Survival means putting out fires. Putting out fires means letting things fester until they actually explode, because the urgent always shoves aside the important. Again, that's where COVID-19 has been very important. So that's a very long-winded answer for me to say my values haven't changed at all. My understanding, my ideology, and very possibly, in a different constellation, I could find myself in a different political platform that is not called blue and white with those same values. But, and this is the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is that the Likud has actually, over the last, 3-4 elections, because of its, I would say, democratic nature, it has a certain leadership that has been there for a very, very long time. And this, you have to believe me, I say in a completely depersonalized and depoliticized way. I do believe in term limitations, and I don't believe in term limitations because of one person or another. I believe in term limitations because they are good for so many reasons, because they enable succession planning, because they enable us to grow future leadership, because we're human beings and we're fallible, because, and I don't say this about one specific person, because power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, we know, is just because of human fallibility. And because at the end of the day, change is something that's very, very important to create a sense that there isn't one person that can lead one country or any institution. And that is not possible at the moment in today's Likud. And so for me to join the political arena, blue and white was an excellent, and I actually came from a more right-wing sort of party that joined into blue and white called Telem, Tnu'a Leumit Mamlachtit, with Bogi Ya'alon. I was honored to write part of the platform of Telem, except that Bogi Ya'alon chose not to join the coalition government. Sadly for me, I thought that that was a very big mistake. And the beauty of creating an understanding that we don't need small little niche parties anymore, if I'm indeed right, that 80% of the people agree about 80% of the issues, 80% of the time, that means that we have the power of moderation, or the muscular moderates. And with the power of moderation comes the responsibility of moderates. And that was what blue and white represented. That was the tremendous opportunity that I saw in joining. And that is actually the sadness that I have, if I really have to reflect back, because the idea is still so right, but the execution was actually very poor. And now to convince the public that the idea was so right will take much, much more work. And there's one more element, and that is that what you see in this upcoming election, this fourth election, is that everybody has now sort of sharpened their swords and is highlighting their differences again. We're back to as if there's like a very huge gaping, distance between left and right. And when you look at what happened in blue and white was this understanding that there is very little that divides us. And by the way, most of what divides us, we argue with ourselves. We're not talking to anybody, namely the Palestinians, about anything that divides us with them. We're talking to ourselves, because at the moment there is no discourse of, where the future of Israel-Palestinian relations are going. And even more, and maybe we'll touch on that a little later, is the potential of the Abraham Accords at this historic junction. With everything that I've said, and we haven't even talked about the challenges for Israel-Diaspora relations, and we touched upon some of the internal challenges of Israeli society and the gap that we've created, maybe with political representation that seems to be a little more polarized than the actual public. But we haven't talked about the international sort of challenges that Israel faces and opportunities that are very much sort of, just really, you can see them. They're so close, and the Abraham Accords certainly represent them, as opposed to the challenges, which are getting bigger and bigger. And really what brought me to the sort of very clear conclusion that I have to enter and sit around policy making tables is actually the golden case and cause that I referred to before. So before I entered Knesset, and I said Simcha Golden was one of the people at my maiden speech. He is the father of Hadar Golden. Hadar Golden is a deceased soldier that was killed and abducted 6.5 years ago during an operation in Gaza, or the war in Gaza. In the midst of 1 hour after an international humanitarian ceasefire brokered by the US and the UN, supported by the EU, was violated by Hamas, a genocidal terror organization. For 6.5 years, Hadar Golden, alongside with another deceased soldier, Oron Shaul, and 2 Israeli civilians who were both mentally unwell, and wandered into Gaza, Vera Mengistu and Hisham Asayed, one from the Ethiopian community, one from the Bedouin community. So you think of this in terms of intersectionality, right? We talk about intersection. It's the representation of the entire Israeli society. 4 of them are held in Gaza for over 6.5 years in standing violation of international law, in standing violation of any kind of moral human code, and nothing has been done. Nothing has been done not only by Israel, but by the countries that brokered that international humanitarian ceasefire, by the countries that supported it, by the countries that are trustees of international law and human rights, by the organizations that are trustees of international law and human rights, including international institutions such as the UN. So after being in the UN and building this legal case and cause, it occurred to me that, the only place where I can really challenge the policy is from within Knesset. And entering Blue and White in that way sort of also enabled me to transcend, the politicization and the personalization that we have seen. And, we all know that at the end of the day, this upcoming election is very much about who is willing to sit with, in the coalition with the sitting prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and who is not, who is unwilling. And literally that has been the majority of the discussion as we approach these 4th elections, instead of, and this is what hurts so much, instead of what we should be discussing, the vision both for the unity, for internal resiliency, for Israel diaspora relations, and for the challenges we face in the international arena.
Michal, I would like to pick up actually on one of these issues that you just mentioned, and that's of course an issue that is central to so many Jews in the world outside Israel, and that's the relationship between the State of Israel and diaspora Jewry. Where do you see some of the important key issues, challenges, but also opportunities for bridging what seems to be becoming a greater and greater distance? Certainly, if you look at certain issues, if you read certain pundits, that is developing over time. And where do you see the future of this relationship go? And more importantly, where do you see your contribution to diaspora-Israel relations?
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Chaba. So I'll tell you the following. First of all, as a member of the Committee on Immigration and Absorption, and as a chair of the Subcommittee for Israel Diaspora Relations, the most important thing for me was to create engagement, was to create discourse, and to bring diaspora communities into Knesset, rather than to bring Knesset to diaspora communities. For Knesset members to actually hear what challenges diaspora communities, what we need to know in order to engage, and to not to talk, but to listen. And so the first, sort of discussions that we held at the committee, one was with students all over the world, actually, not just North America, Europe as well, facing and combating anti-Semitism on their campuses. We had the Bahrain Jewish community after the Abraham Accords were signed. Basically, I mean, it's all on Zoom. So it's where COVID-19 has also sort of opened up our minds. The Bahrain Jewish community was sitting in the Knesset around the committee table, virtually, of course, and Knesset members engaged with them in order to understand their perspective of the Abraham Accords. It's a community that's 140 years old. And for them, this is the first time that they can travel to Israel to find long lost relatives that they have never seen. All kinds of understandings that they've had of coexistence, with their Bahraini neighbors, but things have shifted, things have changed. How have they changed? And that is something that I think is very, very critical to the way that I understand Israel diaspora relations going forward. And that is the importance of engagement in a very different way than we've had so far. And the importance of identifying, I would call it a joint project, because when you think about it, and I said, we're still the founding generation. I don't say this in judgment. The founders of this country, the physical founders, along with diaspora communities that helped with the physical foundation in a variety of ways, including literally, donating in order to be able to build the physical infrastructure, they have built it. They did their job. They created the physical infrastructure for our shared vision, mission, and values. Our generation's responsibility is to build what I would call the spiritual infrastructure. What does it mean to have an Israel that's Jewish and democratic, the nation state of the Jewish people? And actually, one of the first laws that I proposed in Knesset, again, sadly, not enough, it didn't go through, the way that it works in Knesset is 3 readings. It didn't get through the 3 readings, so it was never passed, but it is the basic law Declaration of Independence. So I don't know if, anybody knows this, but just as Canada has the Charter of Rights and the United States has their Declaration of Independence, the state of Israel has a Declaration of Independence, but it was never anchored into law. It is sort of guiding principles and, it's always there in spirit, but it's never been anchored into law. And my understanding, and I think it affects Israel diaspora relations as well, my understanding of the current challenges we face are that the real challenges we face, by the way, it's part of the answer to blue and white, are not what we often think of as the right and the left, but they are the following. They are, is the state of Israel, the miracle that is the 72-year-old state of Israel, is it a Jewish and democratic state founded upon the principles of the Declaration of Independence, of course, promising equality to all of its minorities and all of its citizens, and as the nation state of the Jewish people, an indigenous people returned to its homeland after thousands of years of exile? It says all of that. The Declaration of Independence, and I recommend to read it, it says all of that and more. Or is it a democratic state of all of its citizens? And I'll tell you that there are very large segments in Israel, certainly, of sitting members of parliament, for example, the Joint Arab List, but not only Arabs, that believe, yes, the state of Israel can exist as a democratic state of all its citizens. Or is it a Jewish halacha state? Right? And there are also members of Knesset, members of parliament, that would say, yes, the state of Israel should exist as a Jewish halacha state. Well, that is not what it was founded to be. The mission, vision, and values that we created, this joint project, and that's where Israel diaspora relations come in. We created this joint project as the Declaration of Independence values are very, very clearly presented in the declaration, and actually anchoring it into law or into basic law, which in Israel, again, we don't have a charter. So a basic law actually, sort of has a stronger effect than a regular law. We'll call it that. It trumps the regular law, no pun intended. And so that understanding and that conversation around what is the vision, mission, and values of the state of Israel, we know what the answer is. It's there in the Declaration of Independence. Now we can begin, after we've anchored it into law, as far as I'm concerned, we can begin the discussion of what that looks like. What is that translated into? What does it mean to have a Jewish and democratic state of Israel? What does it mean for what happened just last week with the court, the Supreme Court, accepting reform conversions that were actually conducted in Israel? The news is that these have been accepted if they were conducted in the United States for 20 years. So it's not such big news. But what that means, the fact that it had to go to the Supreme Court of Justice, what that means is that the legislator, we have not done our job. That's what that means. And how do I know? Because for the last 16 years, the Supreme Court of Justice has been pushing off rendering their decision and saying, well, the Knesset needs to legislate. And the Knesset appointed committees, government after government, including a most recent Moshe Nissim, a former Minister of Justice, who submitted recommendations for what we do with conversion. And that would affect not only internal Israeli understanding, let's say for the law of return, the implementation of reform conversions and what they mean, they would, of course, affect the relationship between Israel and diaspora. then the discussion we need to be having about identity, about what that means, about what it looks like to have a Jewish and democratic Israel. So that's just one example of where we have to take responsibility and begin the conversation by utilizing, where necessary, legislation, such as in the case I just described, and where not necessary, both engagement and, covenantal understandings between the communities. The most important piece is that we cannot afford this gap to continue growing. We cannot afford not to engage. We cannot know, there's the famous story about the Rebbe that says to his students, "You say you love me, but do you know what hurts me?" And they say, "No, Rebbe, why would we know what hurts you?" And he says, "Because if you don't know what hurts me, then how could you love me?" And that is where Israel diaspora relations have to lead into the next kind of engagement that we have, so that we do see the way forward for the next 72 years and define the shared projects that we have. And, if you accept sort of my analogy, to build the spiritual infrastructure of what it means to have a sovereign country that is the nation state of a Jewish people that may not all live here, that is in diaspora.
Very inspiring. Michal, you mentioned briefly the Abraham Accords. What is your long-term view of the Abraham Accords? Do you see this as a one-off, isolated event for which Israel can thank the Trump administration, but not only? Or is this the beginning of a whole new chapter in Israel's relations with the Middle East, perhaps even beyond?
So thank you for that question. And actually, I had an amazing, exciting opportunity to host the first ever delegation of young, what's called influencers. They're journalists and they're activists from the UAE and Bahrain and Egypt. Young men and women, by the way, at Knesset on Hanukkah. And I spoke to them literally with tear-filled eyes. I said to them, "This is my own little private Hanukkah miracle. I would have never imagined this. I mean, I could send you a picture. It doesn't seem real to be walking around the Knesset with this delegation of, as I said, men and women from the UAE and Bahrain in full, dressed attire and so forth." I'll tell you, I think it would be, Chaba, a very missed opportunity to see it as a one-off, or even to, credit one or another person with it. First of all, I think it's a result of a long process. And it's a result of a process that actually saw something very interesting, for example, in the UAE, and that is the integration into textbooks of the importance of tolerance. The integration into textbooks, children's textbooks, already talk about the Abraham Accords. And of course, their name attests to them being based on our shared values and our shared heritage and our shared ancestor. And the other reason that it would be a missed opportunity, and I describe as the transition away from what we know of rejectionism that we are so familiar with, to normalization, which the Abraham Accords represent, of course, with UAE and then Bahrain and Morocco and Sudan, and there are more countries that this can shape in the future. And I'll say something about its full potential in a moment. That transition away from rejectionism to normalization was enabled by what I call a pivot away from the 3 no's of the 1967 Khartoum conference: no to recognition of Israel, no to negotiation with Israel, no to peace with Israel, to the 3 yeses: yes to recognition, yes to negotiation, yes to peace. And I have to say in that order, because the paradigm shift is inherent to the order I just said that in. I did not say yes to peace and then negotiation and then recognition. Recognition, and it may seem so basic, but recognition of the other's right to exist as who they are, in Israel's case, as a Jewish and democratic state, the nation state of the Jewish people. Recognition is a fundamental first step that enables negotiation, paving the path to peace and prosperity and everything beyond. Now, the Abraham Accords actually have that potential paradigm shift inherent to them at their very foundation. By the way, you see it in the way that they've been received by the people-to-people warmth. I don't know if you know this, but although we are under COVID-19 constraints, after the Abraham Accords were signed, tens of thousands of Israelis, something like 50,000, at least half of them Arabs, Israeli Arabs, visited the UAE. that's astounding. It happened overnight. And the kind of relationship that's being formed is very, very warm. It is not at all what we know of, in terms of, and we have a history of peace with Egypt and peace with Jordan. It is not a cold peace. It is a very, very warm peace. And that's where I want to move into the second part of the potential of the paradigm shift. It can potentially pave the path backwards for the peace that we have with Egypt, with Jordan, enabling the people, and I separate the people from leadership, for a moment and say enabling the people to recognize the tremendous potential of that peace based on recognition of each other's right to exist, based on tolerance that, as I said, is already taught in children's textbooks. By the way, Bahrain and Morocco have adopted the IRA working definition for anti-Semitism. We can touch on that in a minute, but that's astounding. If I had to say what is the most, incredible representation of recognition, of that word recognition, the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism just doesn't only say, I recognize your right to exist as who you are. It also says, I recognize where you're not allowed to be hated as who you are. It's beyond, just basic recognition. So it enables, if we take the potential paradigm shift that would shed its light on the pieces we already have, it enables the path forward with the Palestinians, and we should not. That's not an elephant in the room. We should talk about that too. The basic principles of recognition, enabling negotiation, paving the path to peace, that is the way forward with all peoples of the region, including the Palestinians. And it does one more thing, which we have to be careful about, and it's very delicate. But it enables Islam to be taken back by moderates. If we talked about the power of moderation and the responsibility of moderates, it enables the moderate Islam to take back, the narrative from radicalized Islam, essentially highlighting the possibility for exactly what the Abraham Accords represent, for shared values and interests. And, that has been no small part, because it is, in fact, Iran's threat to the region that all of these countries, including Israel, of course, share. And that has actually really sort of teased out, if you will, the shared values and interests. And it also has shone a big spotlight on the radicalized forces. You can tell where organizations or countries' preferences are by their response to the Abraham Accords. Of course, Hamas, of course, Hezbollah, of course, Iran, of course, additional countries who opposed the Abraham Accords. That is our axis of evil, that we are now in a shared, combined effort with countries you would have never believed in order to be able to address their threats. So I would say there are three layers of potential in the Abraham Accords, and we would be remiss to put them off as to something that's fleeting and insignificant. And we must actually enable their full potential to be fulfilled by identifying and realizing the opportunities that come with them. And by the way, Canada has a role in that. So I just want to add, all countries have a role in that. So when you think of countries like Canada and the shared values between Israel and Canada, of course, international law and human rights is guiding principles, but Canada as a force for good in the world that actually begins to identify and expose those that challenge our shared values and recognize the tremendous potential and empowers the voices of moderates. Again, I differentiate always, for example, with regards to Iran, the Iranian regime from the people of Iran. And the people of Iran that we should be empowering, those voices that we should be speaking for as trustees of international law and human rights, whose rights are stomped on and violated, but also as onlookers in the families, in the family of nations that basically created a shared value system. And the Abraham Accords speak to those as well.
I do want to mention that there is another very important Montreal connection with the Abraham Accords, because you might know, I'm sure you do, and a number of people in the room or in front of their screens also know, that the first chief rabbi of the community, of the Jewish community in Dubai, was Rabbi Sarna, currently in New York, and formerly from Montreal. So it's very nice how Montreal comes together with global, regional, Israeli, Middle Eastern politics right here.
Absolutely. Thank you for recognizing him. And I'll say one more, Chaba, just one more thing. In the engagements I've had, which have been very moving ever since the Abraham Accords were signed, of course, Rabbi Sarna has been there, but there's also another connection, and that is that Marcy Friedman, who is the Canadian ambassador to the UAE, is from Montreal. Another tremendous Montreal connection. We actually had a Zoom together, the three of us, and a tremendous audience. And they said to us, is Montreal so big that you're all from Montreal originally? And it was quite a nice
yes,
connection.
we are.
Yes, yeah.
Michal, you touched upon the much debated, controversial for some, but definitely much debated definition of anti-Semitism, according to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Tell us your view about the definition, the controversy, and what can be done in order to bridge the differences that have emerged on campuses, in communities, in conversations, so that the discourse could become somewhat more moderate.
So maybe I'll start with an anecdote, and I'll tell you that IRA first came up. I held 4 hearings in the Committee on Immigration and Integration, actually, of all places. But I held 4 hearings regarding the imperative to combat online anti-Semitism with Twitter and Google and Facebook and TikTok. And these 4 hearings presented a very, very grim reality. They coincided with some hearings that were held in the United States, so they actually received tremendous had great echo, certainly in the United States, because they literally, the first hearing took place on the same day as a hearing with Facebook. Although they touched upon a different issue, or maybe a different manifestation of the same issue, and that is the tremendous power that digital platforms have, and the responsibility that comes or should come with that power. Specifically in our case, I called the hearings after very, very virulent anti-Semitism that took place actually beginning on Twitter. There was an online campaign on Twitter, a blackout, a 48-hour blackout, no safe space for Jew hate, which I joined and then called the hearings. And Twitter shared their policy or lack thereof, essentially, and I invite you all to watch it. It's like a 1-minute, very raw sort of exchange between myself and the Twitter representative, where basically she reads out the current Twitter policy that considers the call for genocide saber rattling. And that was literally at the same time as they consider a political statement by certain politicians removable or at least flaggable on Twitter. And so what became very clear at this hearing, and I share this anecdote because what became clear, I say it as a lawyer as well. When you begin to read a law, the first thing that happens is there's definitions. So we're all on the same page. The definition of anti-Semitism is, and lucky for us, Chaba, there is a consensus definition, and this is important to know, that was arrived at after 20 years of democratic process. It didn't just land on our laps, that IRA working definition for anti-Semitism, and it is a very important resource, a very important tool to identify anti-Semitism. Now, of course, the full definition, including its examples, the definition in its entirety, includes what we know of as the 3 Ds, the demonization, the delegitimization, and the double standards against the state of Israel. And from my perspective, we would be remiss if we shy away from engaging with that, with what's called new anti-Semitism. So it's okay to be anti-Zionist, but not anti-Jewish. So it's okay to say COVID-48 and not, depict Jews, because 48 is, of course, the foundation of, the Zionist state of Israel. And we not only need to engage with it, but we need to equip the future generation with the understanding, and students, of course, and I've engaged with many, many groups of students about this, to inform themselves of the history of IRA, of how this consensus working definition was agreed upon after a 20-year democratic process, of why every word in that definition, including the examples, are important to understand, of why they include the difference between criticizing Israel, which is fine, like you criticize any other country, as opposed to singling out Israel, which is double standards, which You know, the ability to think that genocide, again on Twitter, is somehow saber rattling, but if you call for genocide of any other people, that would be something that at the very least would get flagged, or of individuals, that would be something that would get flagged, makes you begin to ponder on the notion of double standards. And I want to say something very important. And actually, the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs has a very, very important sort of understanding of the way that the anti-Semitism virus mutates. Now we're all virus experts because of COVID-19, and we understand there's mutations. Well, the anti-Semitism virus has mutated as well. And since the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948, there has been a mutation in the virus of anti-Semitism, and we see it today on our campuses, and it can theoretically rip us apart as a people. It can, in theory, actually ravage the connection between Israel and diaspora communities, because it enables people to say, no, I'm a Jew, I'm a proud Jew. I just have nothing to do with that Zionist state of Israel. And that is not something that I believe we should be ignoring. I think we need to be engaging with it very, very intimately, with the students feeling it, with the groups representing it. And the attempts that I see now to change the definition, or to alter the definition, or to take apart the definition and adopt only parts of it. By the way, Facebook and Twitter, after those discussions we held in the Knesset, I mean, I don't know if it was connected or disconnected, actually adopted a part of IRA, the part that engages with Holocaust denial. But when you take just one little piece of a definition and you enable essentially, and we know this is, you know, certainly as lawyers, but we know this as individuals, when you take one little part, essentially what you're enabling is everything else that doesn't fall under that one little part to actually exist, to continue existing. And that's what's happened recently. And actually, in every engagement that I have, including with the digital platforms, Adopt IRA is a very big part of our discussion with the digital platforms. And I can tell you that following these 4 hearings at the Knesset, I actually founded an interparliamentary international bipartisan task force with members of parliament from Canada and the US and the UK and Australia and New Zealand. And one of the most important discussions that we have is about IRA, because in order to define it, or excuse me, in order to combat it, you must first define it. And we have an agreed upon definition, which has been adopted by over 28 countries, which has been adopted by sports leagues, which has been, and you know, we open up a Webster's dictionary and the definition that's there is still there. You may have challenges with some parts of the definition. You may not like some parts of it. You may want to argue about some, and that is all okay. That is all within the confines of important engagement. But changing a definition because it doesn't suit something for some reason is something that should actually alert us all and alarm us all, and something that we need to sort of dig down deeper and understand what the source of it is. And I would argue the source of it is that morphed version of anti-Semitism that we know of as anti-Zionism or anti-Israel. And because we see it, because it's actually our shared responsibility and our shared commitment, I actually believe that it's a big part of our shared discussion and imperative for engagement, so that we don't lose the ability to talk about it. And what is the difference between criticizing Israel, like you criticize any other country? By the way, IRA includes the ability to criticize the state of Israel, of course, as opposed to what happens only with regards to the state of Israel, and that is to delegitimize its very right to exist, bringing me back to the fundamental change of recognition. Delegitimizing the right of any country to exist, we've never heard that. How come it's relevant only for the state of Israel? And we have to ask ourselves that. And at the end of the day, remember that when we engage in this, we should and must engage intersectionally with Jews and non-Jews, because if you cannot protect one minority, one religion, one country, it is imperative we understand this. You actually cannot protect any minority, any religion, any country. That's true for what we may dive into next. And that's, you know, with regards to international law, even with a recent decision of the ICC as one example of it, right? And the importance that we have a shared mechanism, shared values, shared principles that are applied equally and consistently to all. You can't single out one country and say that you're doing that.
Michal, with your permission, let me share with you a couple of questions that came in from the chat, through the chat. And one of them is a policy question, and the other one is more of a personal question about your current and future political involvement and engagement. So the policy question is from Eleanor Bonder, and here it goes. How do you feel about the fact that the acceptance of liberal conversion in Israel only works for the law of return? It doesn't work for marriage in Israel. Is that right? And what's your take on it?
Right.
And the personal question is from Lillian Weinberg. Let me just share it with you so you could allocate the time and you could decide how you want to, maybe you can massage them together. Lillian's question is whether you see any way for the continuation of your work that you've been doing on the committees in the Knesset. It sounds like you were very passionate about all the work that you've done and you clearly were making a difference. Is there room and opportunity for you to be still engaged now that you're taking a break from elected office?
So first of all, thank you for both questions. I'll start with a second. First of all, love to Lillian. I don't see her on my screen, but knowing she's there warms my heart. So what I would say is I'm in the process of identifying the best platforms from which I can continue doing exactly that. So serving the intersection of the issues that I've spoken about, whether it's the internal Israeli resiliency of society, whether it's Israel diaspora relations, or whether it's Israel standing in on the international arena and, you know, the various challenges that we face there. And I didn't mention, but actually I was, for the first time, I was appointed to the role of the liaison on the issue of the ICC, the International Criminal Court. So that when we talk about the challenges that Israel faces, that sort of just, it like, you know, was head on, being in that first time role as a member of parliament, of Israel's parliament, engaging with other parliamentarians. And yes, I am, on one hand, very, very careful to identify the platforms from which I can continue engaging with the intersection or with each of those topics separately, or the intersection between them. And on the other hand, I'm resolved to find the ways to lean in and enter the Knesset in the near future. I mean, I would hope for our country that we have a very stable government, and that'll be in 4 years. And I have a tremendous amount of time to you know, sort of find the right platform from which to enter. But it's not just about the platform. I'll say the following: the platform that I either enter from an existing platform or a new platform has to be able to advance the issues and represent the voices that I've been so honored to represent. And you touched upon it before, Csaba, briefly, and I call it, for lack of a better word, and you know, definitions are important to me, so I call it olim, but it's really anybody that has the perspective of the state of Israel from the outside in rather than from the inside out. And when you have that perspective, recognizing the importance of the intersection between everything I just said, Israel's national, internal, societal challenges and resiliency and unity, and the things we spoke about before, good governance and so on, the importance of Israel diaspora relations, and the imperative to engage with Israel's challenges in the international arena. Those are issues that in this last Knesset, I was able to actually challenge in every single committee that I sit on to sound a different voice, to sound a voice that I know wasn't there before, and that I was told wasn't there before, usually by the professionals of the committee. You know, this is something people don't realize, but the politicians change, but the legal advisors and the directors of the committees, they're there for years, 20 years and 30 years, and they are actually very important because they are the institutional memory, if you will. So I was very, very privileged to have very good working relationships with many of them. And indeed, the commitment to continue sounding that voice and to represent the Israeli public and to serve the Israeli public and the Jewish people abroad is something that will drive me to find the best ways to come back in. Because at the end of the day, the only way to change policies and sound those voices and sit around the decision-making tables is to lean in and be there. So that is part of what's guiding my next steps, sort of a long-term, midterm, and short-term strategy. And God willing, it's long-term, because it may be that in 6 months we head to elections again, and then it becomes a very short-term strategy. With regards to the first question, thank you for that important question, because that is the perfect example for the issues that we are not tackling, that we're not talking about, that we're not discussing even as we approach elections next week, that we need to be talking about, right? What does it mean? So is Israel, as Jewish and democratic in its own sovereign country, but also the nation state of the Jewish people, ready to recognize other conversions other than Orthodox conversions? And how should that be done? And by the way, the Nassim Commission that I referred to before, took great steps to actually engage with diaspora communities and create an agreed upon solution that would enable a conversion process that was much more welcoming by enabling, for example, rabbis, municipal rabbis, so community rabbis, really something very similar to what happens in diaspora, rather than what happened here in a sovereign country where an institution, the rabbinate, was created. And, that has its own set of challenges. So there are solutions. It's just up to the Knesset to take responsibility and up to the executive branch to execute that responsibility in a very different way than we have. And I believe that is the calling of our generation. That is the responsibility of our generation. That is for me at least, that is the motivator for everything that I do in terms of my commitment to continue, because these are important, imperative conversations. We don't have so many great experiences with passing the age of 72. The history of the Jewish people sees us as sovereigns more or less where we are today. 72 is just about the cutoff. And we have a tremendous challenge in our generation, in a sovereign state after thousands of years of exile. And in order to, and I often say this in all kinds of contexts, in order to actually enable, or at least give us a fighting chance to create the next 72 years, we have to adopt a sovereign mindset. Sovereignty is not just about geography. Sovereignty is about a mindset. And in many ways, we haven't grown up enough yet to understand that a sovereign country has to take responsibility. By the way, it's also true for Israel diaspora relations in the way that we engage in terms of the relationship paradigm. What does that mean in terms of, for example, financial support of diaspora of Israel? What does this relationship look like? Where is this mutual or shared partnership? Is it solely a fundraising relationship? Is it only based on shared projects that are very physical, or is it based on what you referred to in your question? And that is the spiritual next tier, if you will, of our shared project, of this relationship of being a sovereign country that has, on one hand, civilian sort of legislation like the law of return, but on the other hand, and this is really important, becomes the center for Judaism, not just for Jews, because that's sort of the balance between, has shifted. Most of the world's Jews are in Israel today, right? When we look numerically, the state of Israel has to take responsibility not just for Jews in Israel and all over the world, but also for Judaism. And that changes the way that we should look at things in order to enable a continued conversation between Jews around the world about their Judaism.
Michal, in the interest of time and to make sure also that I'm not going to abuse your generosity and the generosity of the time that you've been giving us, let me just share one other comment with you. It's really not phrased as a question. It's a comment that you could take as an invitation to reflect further upon, or not. Let me nonetheless just read it out because it's important, I think, to voice it in this context. So the comment comes from Professor Yael Halevi-Weiss, who was our guest just a few days ago when she spoke to our Institute audience about her recent book about Aleph Bet Yehoshua and his literary oeuvre. And Yael's point to you is as follows. An attachment between diaspora Jewry and Israel will continue to be imperiled so long as Zionism continues to be routinely defined as a movement invented in the 1880s, rather than part and parcel of identity of the people of Israel since ancient times. Among virtually all academics and the many far-reaching documentaries and so on, this confusion between a modern political Zionist movement and Zionism proper continues to be routinely propagated even among the best meaning presenters. Any comment?
It's actually a very interesting, I would love to engage further on that because it challenges me to think about the way that we frame things. And we talked a little bit about definitions before and the importance of, maybe, Zionism with a small z as opposed to Zionism with a big Z, as the way that the listener may be able to engage with it, and the importance of finding the bridges between Israel and diaspora with regards or through Zionism. So that's a tremendous, and I would love to engage. Maybe you can, sort of send our contact information to one another, because that sounds like a fascinating conversation, or next time we can engage on that topic in discussion. A really important point, and I look forward to both to reflecting and to hearing more about it.
We'll be happy to do that, to make the connection. Absolutely, Michal. So since we are reaching, in fact, we are exceeding the time limit that that I kind of was hoping to stick to. And thank you so much, Michal, that you accepted our invitation and you gave us this early evening hour away from your family, away from your work, to be here with us on the internet. I do want to perhaps thank you and say goodbye to you through the voices of some of the praises that came in also. Here is one from Monica. Forgive me. Here is the message. Exciting to see that the little girl with the long pigtails who came to Montreal those many years ago has become a powerful and dynamic lady. Your kind of leadership is sorely needed in Israel. Yesher koach. And another message from Edna and Danny Janko. We are so proud of you. Not surprising at all of what you have achieved in your very young life. This definitely is your place. And we wish you to go from strength to strength. Kol hakavod. And what more can I say? Thank you very much, Michal, once again. And let me ask the members of the audience once again, and join me in a virtual round of applause to say thank you for our guest, member of Knesset, Michal Cotler-Wunsh.
Thank you, everybody.
All the very best. And
thank you, everybody.
Thank
you for the opportunity to engage, and be well, everyone. It's fantastic to, engage with you and to see you, even if virtually.
And this is also my cue to turn it over to Jennifer, without whose able assistance, none of our events would actually be implemented. So thank you, Jennifer, ever so much for organizing, helping with working out the connections with Michal, her assistant Becca, and also bringing everything so effectively under our screens today. And thank you, Jennifer, for sharing information about our upcoming events that we, of course, invite everyone to come back to spend time with us and join us. On March 22nd at 4 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, we will be featuring a conversation with Francine Zuckerman, who will be joining us from New Zealand. And she will be telling us about the movie, the documentary that she made a couple of years ago after Munich. Those of you who register for the conversation, we will actually provide you with a link to watch the film the day before. So please stay tuned and join us on March 22nd. And please come back to part 3 in our series on From Montreal to Israel, which will be a conversation with Professor Gil Troy. And this will take place on Wednesday, April 7th at 1 p.m. I would normally say same place, but of course, normally that would be in Concordia. Today, that means on the internet. And Jennifer has a couple more slides to show us. Thank you, Jennifer. On April 11th, we'll be featuring, in collaboration with the Jewish Public Library of Montreal, a film, Israel, Le Voyage Interdit. Please make sure to connect and register through the website of the JPL. This is a fantastic, very interesting movie, as is the next one, Amen, 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 which of course tells the story in so many ways of the Abraham Accords that we also talked about with Michal today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. If you missed any of our events, we invite you to visit our website or our YouTube channel. Certainly today's talk also was recorded, and we will be, just in a matter of a few days, we will be able to make it available to all of you and your friends also through our YouTube channel at the Azrieli Institute. Michal, thank you ever so much again, and we wish you all the best, b'hatzlacha gdola, and of course, a beautiful, beautiful upcoming Chag. Pesach Sameach v'kasher to you and all your loved ones.
Thank you. Chag Sameach to everybody, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Michal. Bye-bye.